Hello, everyone. Today I'd like to answer a question I get quite frequently, and that is, why did I leave the Libertarian political movement? But to do that, we have to go back in time just a little bit and talk about some past events. When it comes to politics, most of us are products of our times. The experiences and preferences we have for certain ways of thinking, almost all of our political thoughts are a reaction to some period in time, and I'm no different, and I have no shame in admitting that. So, I was a child of the Bush years, George W. Bush. I vaguely remember the end of the Clinton presidency, but I didn't really get into politics until about the midway through George W. Bush's 2 terms. And I remember very clearly the Obama years, and it all just sort of spiraled downhill from that. Now, of course, I remember the events of 9/11 quite well and the culture of America before and afterwards. It's kind of a weird thing to look back on now, but there's a distinction between those 2 time periods. But I always had questions as to why we were in so many wars in the Middle East and sort of the culture surrounding that very warlike period. Lots of American flags and bumper stickers, and the whole culture seemed very out of place to me at the time. Now, admittedly, I was too young to fully understand exactly everything that was going on at the time, but I still had a lot of questions that couldn't really be answered. And one of the things that I turned to was the anti-war movement, because it seemed like these people had all the answers, the sort of hip new wave Democrats that were coming out of the woodworks to oppose the Bush presidency and set themselves up for what would eventually turn into the Obama presidency. Now, I had done some reading and listened to some pundits on the radio and on TV and things like that. So by the time Obama came into power, I was already questioning the things that were going on within the United States government. I really wasn't sure how I felt about some things. Other issues I was pretty staunch on. I was raised fairly secular, so obviously the Christian moralizers weren't really my thing, but there was something off about the Democrats. Something that just didn't seem right. And now I know what that is. It's the progressivism that they espouse now. And obviously, as the Obama presidency progressed, I became more and more distant from this whole political scene. I was very nihilistic when it came to politics at the time. Because of the things that I had learned, I was way ahead of all of my peers when it came to these questions. Now, since I went to a school that was mostly black and Hispanic when Obama came around for the first time, it was a huge deal. But it wasn't a huge deal for the issues that I thought it was. I thought it was going to be a new era. We could get away from the Bush politics, the Republican politics, and maybe try something new. But everyone around me had no idea what politics even were. They had no idea what a budget deficit was, what capitalism even was, what socialism was. They could barely read and write. They just saw Democrat. Oh, and he happened to be black. That was the big deal. Everyone was going to vote for Obama because he was black. And that sentiment really left me jaded. Both political parties I couldn't identify with. And eventually I stumbled upon the liberty movement. It started with the sort of conservative types, what many might consider the Tea Party types, the Ron Pauls, sort of socially liberal in some aspects, or at least didn't talk about it, but were really hard on the economics. And obviously, during this time period, we had a huge financial crisis, so I was very focused on learning more about the economy and why things were so shit. And the Libertarian Party, so to speak, the sort of Liberty Party as a whole, sort of these conservatives who are not Christian moralizers, but actually focused on economic conservatism, sort of capitalism, things like this. It was really appealing because of the time period that I was in. And of course, me being young and inexperienced with politics, there was a lot of good information coming from these groups for the most part. But I had thought that I had found the holy grail of political ideologies. I mean, the libertarians had an answer for everything. And I mean everything. But I would come to find out that they really didn't have an answer for everything. It was all a facade. But as I found out about more and more about this libertarian movement, and I got engaged with folks online, and I started attending some local meetups and sort of semi-right-wing conservative political meetings and things like that. I picked up a lot of reading material. I started learning, reading and watching people like Friedman and Rothbard, and eventually I stumbled across Hoppe and all of these other, we all know these figures by now. And to me, being a reactionary of the time, it all made sense. It was all so clear to me at the time. But as the Obama presidency progressed, there were some questions that the libertarians could not answer, or they could not provide a sufficient answer for me. And when working within the framework, the sort of philosophical principles of libertarianism, there were some questions that I could not come up with an answer to. And one of those was the big social issues of our time. Obviously, I was raised in an area where whites are not that common. So the demographic issue really played a large part in my life. And as I was reading more and more about libertarianism and getting more active in the community, I actively pushed this to the back of my mind, saying, demographics, not a big deal, so on and so forth. Sort of like the civic nationalists do. But as race relations in the United States began to break down even more, I remember very clearly the whole Trayvon Martin thing, obviously the inflammation by Democrats and Obama himself, things really got to get polarized. And again, I searched for answers in the libertarian philosophy, but nothing could come very close. And this is, of course, when I stumbled across Hans Hermann Hoppe and his more really right-leaning libertarianism. And from him, when I decided to trek outside my comfort zone a little bit more and move to the more dissident or radical right, this was in the early stages of what we would call the alternative right movement today. As I began to venture out of my comfort zone with Hans Hermann Hoppe and his version of right libertarianism, I discovered the old traditions of the Western world politically. I found out about writers like Evola and Spengler. Because at the time I was fairly open-minded about most things except for communism, I was convinced to pick up a copy of Mein Kampf. And honestly, no one had ever encouraged me to read it, or any of these books for that matter. None of the books about classical Western traditions and the philosophy of the other right-wing associations in this grand scheme of things. And I can't pin it down to one book or one writer or one YouTube video or forum post that really flipped a switch in my brain, but over time, I just became almost disgusted with the way that libertarians and the whole liberty movement was acting towards what I considered more pressing issues, and the social issues to be more exact. For so many years, I had ignored these social issues that were right in front of my face affecting me. And this sort of ideological blinders that I had on prevented me from really seeing the light, if you want to use that phrase. And as I began to read more and more dissident right literature, I broke away from libertarian philosophies, and I very easily deconstructed some of the more common arguments that libertarians put forth. I stopped questioning the legitimacy of the state and reformed my opinions based on human behavior, evolution, and the social sciences. I began to understand social dominance hierarchies and how humans form society and states and all of these other things that had been figured out for 100 years at this point. Things that, writings that people had never told me even existed, never even alluded to it. I had to search the what many would consider the deepest corners of the web to find out about these materials. But that leads me to where I am today. These very hard-pressing questions that the libertarians could not answer led me down a path towards a philosophical position that can answer these questions and is backed up with more substance rather than just ideological ties. So overall, what really turned me away from this liberty movement was reading more and more of their materials and trying to dive a little bit deeper, only to find out that the pool was only about 2 feet deep. And I uncovered this whole other world of right-wing thinking that I'd either brushed off in the past or just had my blinders on that I didn't read. And for those of you who are still stuck in this libertarian phase, and I don't mean to say that in a negative way, believe me, it's just one step in your political evolution. But there's a whole other world out there. So I would encourage you to join me in this exploration of this dissident right-wing thinking. But now, let me turn the question onto you. Where are you at in your political journey? Have you left the liberty movement? Is there something that turned you away from this side of politics? Are you still there? I want to hear your story. What brought you to this side of the political spectrum? I'd really like to know. So you can find me in the description. There's a link to the Discord server and my Twitter if you'd like to reach out for me. Again, leave a comment if you'd like to talk about your journey over time through politics. Thanks for listening.